I found the account at 2:13 a.m., half asleep and angry, and the world before that moment felt like a lie I'd been slow walking into. The notification had been innocuous, a like on a photo I'd posted, but his phone was face down on the coffee table and his thumb kept tapping the screen when he thought I wasn't looking. I reached for it the way you reach for a hot pan without thinking because something about the way he hid his phone felt wrong. It was a small thing, it was a quiet, stupid thing. It became everything that I didn't mean to scroll. I told myself I wouldn't. But the lock screen showed the username at the top of a message preview, and curiosity is a tricky thing that bangs at you until you let it in. He'd logged into an alt account, not on Instagram, not Facebook, but on Reddit. A username I didn't recognize. I tapped it, and the feed opened into a version of him I thought I knew and suddenly didn't. A man who posted late-night confessions about my girlfriend who nags about little things, a man who commented casually about other women's photos, and a man who wrote long, vivid fantasies about getting away. The kind that make your stomach knot because you can picture him in those sentences. The first thing I did was hold my breath. The second thing was panic. Should I wake him? Should I pretend not to have seen? He slept like a log. The rise and fall of his chest an image I'd memorized the way people memorize a partner's laugh. The room smelled faintly of his cologne and the takeout from earlier. I read and read. Each post felt like a small cut. The anonymity seemed to give him permission to air things he never said to my face. This is where the story is always simple in the retelling and messy in the living. It wasn't only that he had an account. Lots of people have side accounts. It was what he did with it, and what he said in the precise language of someone who could be careless with another person's heart. He answered questions about how to see if your partner is into someone else. He wrote about scenarios where he left without looking back, and he voted and encouraged others to just do it and don't feel bad. The one that sucked the air out of me was a detailed post about a fling that didn't end well, told like a story where he was the protagonist, and I was a shadow he left behind. He wrote it as if the consequences were paper thin. I slept on the couch that night, though he never woke. I pretended later that I'd simply needed space, that I'd had trouble with my back. The next morning had to be ordinary groceries, our dog, the office emails, because if you let the breaking show early, it spreads. But the secret was a live coal in my pocket. I pretended it wasn't burning. What I wanted was a conversation. What I got in the first attempt was defensiveness. He said, "It's just Reddit," like that explained the feelings it had created. He laughed when I brought up the posts, like shock and casualness were interchangeable. "I post dumb stuff all the time," he said. "I don't mean anything by it. But there's a difference between locker room talk and repeated confessions about dissatisfaction. There's also a difference between saying something and writing it down like you mean it. The pain wasn't primarily betrayal. It was the slow discovery that someone you thought of as your safe harbor had built a small, secret harbor of his own. It felt childish and cruel at once, as if the person I loved had tucked away a private room where he practiced being someone else. I told myself to be reasonable. He told me he loved me. The question was, did those statements and the things behind them occupy the same world? Or had we been living parallel stories that only crossed when convenient? Once the initial shock subsided, I tried to map the pattern. The account wasn't new. There were comments stretching back months, always at odd hours. 1 a.m., 3 a.m., shifts that matched the times he came home late from work. He'd told me he was staying late sometimes. He'd said it with small apologies and a tired face, and I believed him because I wanted to. The words on the screen suggested something else, that the late nights were filled with more than spreadsheets and coffee. Did I printed screenshots? Yes, a ridiculous, almost forensic reaction because my memory felt unreliable and I wanted a paper trail of the person he was away from me. The printed pages were cold and shockingly objective. They didn't interpret tone or intention, they just displayed a post about wanting more excitement next to a comment complimenting a coworker's legs. A thread where he asked for advice on how to reignite someone's interest in you. Comments that read like strategic notes rather than the raw outpouring of someone in emotional pain. I replayed the moments we'd had against the words I'd read. I thought about casual jokes he'd made about other people. I thought about the way he'd stopped mid-sentence before saying, "I love you" sometimes, like he'd been practicing the words in a private mirror. The memories started to rattle. There was the time he said our relationship was comfortable, the time he admitted he sometimes felt bored, and the time he told me we should do something different, as if he meant the relationship rather than a weekend trip. Did I try to ask him about specifics? The first conversation we had about the account collapsed into circular defenses. He insisted the posts were fantasies, writing exercises maybe, that every person has inner monologues and outlets for them. He argued that anonymity allowed people to play with ideas they'd never voice. He sounded reasonable in the way people sound reasonable when they're trying to shape a narrative that preserves themselves, but then I found a private message thread. That one hit harder than the public posts because it showed intent and engagement with real people. Messages where he flirted, a little at first, and then with more boldness. A woman who messaged him about a common hobby, and he followed with slightly personal compliments. He made plans. He backed out. He joked but kept the conversation alive. He was practicing with someone else. Practicing. The word was brutal because it implied premeditation. Not an accident, not a lapse, but a rehearsal. I confronted him with a folder of digital evidence because confrontation without proof felt like accusation, and I didn't want to play that card. He admitted to having the account but minimized. It was a phase. It was just curiosity. The tone was old and familiar, a familiar tilt toward explanation that begged me to accept the least painful version of the truth. I wanted to accept that version because otherwise the alternative was dismantling a life I had built for years with him. We began therapy because I couldn't sleep, because fights had started to sound like knock-knock jokes the second they began, predictable, rehearsed, and because our friends started to notice the frosted dinner parties. He told the therapist he didn't understand why I was hurt. "It's anonymous," he said. "It's like reading a book." The therapist let that sit in the room like a fragile object. She asked him how the posts would make me feel if they were about me. He blinked. He said he hadn't thought of it. Part of the problem is that secrets compound. You tell one little untruth about a login, and then you tell yourself you're protecting your partner, and then you get tangled in silence. He'd changed passwords, used a burner email, and made sure the account wasn't linked to our shared devices. That coordination of small deceptions felt less like an experiment and more like engineering. It suggested he built a private world intentionally. The day I found a flyer on his car with a woman's name and a number, a scrap of someone else's contact information, I felt the world tilt like a table whose legs had been sawed halfway through. He said it was nothing, a contact from a meetup. He said he forgot to delete it. He said more things that were small and eager-sounding. I wanted to believe him again. I wanted him to be clumsy rather than cruel, but what gnawed at me wasn't a single lie. It was the accumulation of secret life and the illusions of safety. I understood that humans are complicated. I knew people crave private spaces. But there's private space that's harmless, and then there's private space used to rehearse a life outside your relationship. I felt like someone who'd been sharing a tent with another person who had built a hidden door to another tent. We reached the moment when one of us had to choose a path. Keep living in this shadowed cooperation, or pull the blinds and see what sunlight would reveal. He told me he would delete the account. He wrote a message to the woman and told her they couldn't speak anymore. He printed an apology for me, folding it into the place where he keeps the spare receipts. It read like a script. Contrition, ownership plan. He signed up for more therapy sessions. He promised transparency. He volunteered to share passwords. He even suggested couples counseling, but promises are elastic. Weeks passed. He would share small things, a text message here or there, but I still found instances when the anonymity emerged like mold in the grout. He'd stay late at work, then come home smelling faintly different, and when I'd ask, he'd be vague. We had drinks with a client, he'd say, and the client's name would be conveniently forgotten. Paranoia does weird things. I began to test him, to ask where he was going to be, to call. It felt petty and necessary. The suspense built like a story you wish would skip to the last page. There were nights I'd stand outside his car, watching the house light go on, waiting to see if he'd come back in, and then remember to fetch whatever invisible excuse he'd left inside. The dog would whine, and I would tell myself I was being ridiculous. He wasn't a creep, he was my partner. But the secret had opened a Fisher Point one evening. He told me he needed a weekend away to clear his head. Time apart, he said in that way that sounds like growth. I think space will help. When he left, he packed light and kissed my forehead, and the house seemed to exhale. He turned his phone off for part of the drive. I was at home with the dog, insisting to myself I would be fine. 2 hours later, a direct message popped up on the account I'd somehow to log back into. I told you. Stupid curiosity. The ember never leaves. It was her. A photo. A caption. A plan. He'd arranged a meeting. The messages were explicit. They weren't fantasies. They weren't practice. They were logistics. I could see timestamps and addresses and the kind of planning that felt like a small, quiet betrayal. And my hands shook so badly, I could barely text him. I called instead, a raw sound. When he answered, there was a strange stillness in his voice, a pattern of someone who'd been caught and was now trying to reroute the story. He said he didn't go, that he'd canceled last minute. But the messages suggested otherwise. There were matching check-ins with a location app from the night before. There were times that overlapped in ways that made excuses flimsy. I remember the exact way my living room looked. The lamp on, a stack of books, the dog curled, my face lit in the bluish screen glow. Everything in the room became evidence. I printed more. I messaged the woman from the account, which in hindsight was an act of madness, asking pointed questions. She responded with short, startled denials, and then silence. I gave her the benefit of the doubt because the alternative, believing collusion, was more unbearable than uncertainty. We had a fight that lasted 6 hours and 3 days. It contained the usual theater, slammed doors, tears that felt performative and then genuine, accusations that escalated into recriminations. He accused me of snooping. I accused him of emotional infidelity. Somewhere in the middle he said, I never cheated on you. Like this was a talisman that should make things whole again. But emotional cheating is sloppy and corrosive, and sometimes precedes the physical kind. When someone invests intimacy elsewhere, even in messages, the foundation shifts that I asked him to choose. Me, the relationship, or the anonymous life he'd cultivated. He said he wanted to work on us. He promised again. He said sorry in ways that made me believe him for the hour it takes to fall asleep. The problem was the erosion of trust. You can say sorry, but the memory of the words he wrote in the account, the private exercises in dissatisfaction and fantasy, remained. It sat between us like an unwelcome piece of furniture. There is a point where you realize staying is not the same as loving. For me, that point came slow, with small decisions that accumulated into a verdict. I could not live as a forensic partner, cataloging evidence and constantly testing the narrative he wanted to sell. I could not be the person who measured every lateness and labeled every mistake. Love is not a ledger. It is messy and trusting and vulnerable. But it is also not an invitation to rehearse leaving. That I asked for one final transparency exercise. Full access to devices, appointments, social media, the works. He balked. He said it was invasive. He said rebuilding trust required mutual restoration, not surveillance. He was right, and he was wrong. Because for me, the thing that had been stolen was not privacy, but honesty. He could say the account was harmless, but the hidden conversations had already shifted the balance. The breaking conversation wasn't dramatic. It happened over cold pizza and a playlist we both used to like. He sat across from me, tired in a way that looked like defeat. I told him I loved him. I did. And I told him I couldn't reconcile the man who wrote intimate fantasies about leaving with the man who kissed me goodnight. I said that staying would mean excusing the building of secret rooms, and that excusing that behavior would teach me to see betrayal as normal. He asked if I'd consider a break. He asked if I could forgive. He tried to show me the vulnerability that he'd hidden, tears, explanations, a long account of loneliness and confusion. He painted himself not as villain, but as a fragile, flawed creature who'd made terrible choices. He held up his own pain as if that could level the field. It didn't. I believed some of it. But the harm had been done. That I moved out 2 weeks later, because leaving felt less like a surrender and more like reclaiming ground. We had shared a lease and a dog and a set of keys and a Spotify account. Unwinding those knots was literal and agonizing. I packed plates and memories, and an extra sweater he had left behind. He helped because he wanted to be helpful, because he thought that would fix things. Maybe it would have, in a different configuration. Our breakup did not explode on social media or in a courthouse. It unraveled the way most adult heartbreaks do, with small logistical cruelties and the quiet decay of mutual habits. He texted a few times after I left, asking how I was, then asking if we could try slowly. I answered once, and then stopped. Distance clarified the smell of trust and the smell of rot. You noticed the difference that we had a final conversation, mediated by a therapist who'd seen us both at our most performative. He said he would delete the account for good. He said he would do more therapy and find healthier outlets. He promised to not see the woman again. He meant it, perhaps. But promises are not proof, and some things can't be resealed once the envelope has been opened and read. The weeks after moving out were a weird inventory of feelings. There was relief, sharp and volcanic, because I no longer had to pretend to not see the things that gnawed at me. There was grief, the kind that is not only for the person but for the version of yourself that trusted without reservation. I mourned that naive part, the me that assumed love and transparency were givens. I mourned shared playlists and the stupid private jokes that now felt like artifacts. There was also fury. It burned a clean, righteous line through my days. Fury at the secrecy. Fury at the cowardice it takes to hide behind anonymity while practicing leaving someone you supposedly love. Fury at how easy it is for people to rationalize small betrayals until they are large ones. I used that fury to clean the apartment I had left, to set boundaries with mutual friends who'd taken his side or who tried to minimize what happened. Sometimes I fantasize about confronting the account again, sending a thread that explains, calmly and precisely, what the post did to me. But I know people never change because a stranger types angrily at midnight. Change requires discomfort and self-reflection and often a book of consequences. Maybe he will change. Maybe he has. But the story of us is different now. Healing involved reclaiming ordinary trust. I learned to ask questions and expect answers without being either accusatory or passive. I leaned on therapy and friends and started dating myself, going to movies alone, and learning how to feel whole on my own. It is a slow alchemy. Sometimes I catch myself flinching at the sight of someone tapping their phone. I tell myself it is okay. Habits fracture slowly, that I don't think of him as a villain. He was someone who made selfish choices and maybe lacked the courage to wrestle with dissatisfaction in direct, painful ways. I believe in nuance. I also believe in boundaries. You can care for someone and still refuse to live by a rule they refuse to honor. I chose boundaries. If there is a lesson here, it is not just don't make secret accounts. It's about honesty. It's about the small corrosions that start as idle clicking and turn into a life that can be built without you. It's about naming pain when you feel it, not letting it calcify into a secret. I learned that my love deserved someone who would bring their whole self into the tent, not someone building another tent on the side. I still think of him sometimes. I wonder if he's happier. I wonder if he ever reads what he wrote and feels the weight of it. Part of me hopes he learned. Another part hopes he sat with what he did and understands the quiet violence of hiding. Mostly, I am learning how to trust again and what trust actually looks like. I still don't know if I did the right thing. What would you have done?